Betty was in an operating room when the radio announced the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. She ran home. War had begun and life turned upside down. The sun still shone the same. And the weather was perfectly stable, but everything changed. People rushed everywhere, worried of being late. The word evacuation hung in the air. Betty was helping her parents pack for evacuation when she received an order to report for duty immediately. "Would you, please, postpone my draft just for one day? I need to evacuate my family first," she begged. "Don't worry about your family. We take care of medical personnel's families. We'll evacuate them on the very first train." Betty didn't even have a chance to say goodbye to her parents and sister and was driven away with others in a roofless truck to the front. They didn't yet know the challenge they were about to face and the horror they were about to experience, so they sang patriotic songs all the way, in preparation to face the enemy. Betty didn't sing. Thinking of her promise to Lev. She didn't even have a chance to write him a letter. She was thinking about her parents and sister, worried sick about them. She put so much effort into bringing them back to life, to heal their wounds, to see them smile and move around with energy again. Now, she was not sure if they were going to survive the evacuation. "Everything is going to be fine," she tried to comfort herself. "They promised to take care of medical personnel's families first. Where are they taking us?" A soldier sitting next to Betty asks. "We are heading west," the answer followed from the other end of the truck. The first explosions tore through the world around Betty. "I guess it's not that far," the soldier replied. The truck kept running toward the sound of the front line. The road was bumpy, which made the ride in the truck very rough. The explosions were so close that it felt like they were all around. The truck went into a forest and stopped at a campground. There were a couple of tents in between trees. The ground was covered with wounded and dead soldiers. There were too many of them, everywhere. Heavily bleeding, dismembered, crying for help, praying, and not praying anymore. Betty jumped off the truck and froze at the horror that surrounded her. Her instinct pushed her to run and do something, but instead, she stood there, looking around in complete shock, not knowing where to go or whom to help first. A soldier came out of a shed. "Nurse! Nurse!" he yelled, and Betty ran inside. A couple of soldiers held down an injured man while a doctor amputated his leg. It looked like a routine procedure. Only the wounded man rolled his eyes in excruciating pain. "Scrub in," the doctor ordered, and Betty's job as a field hospital surgical nurse had begun. Betty learned soon enough that anesthetics were not available in the field hospital, so major surgeries were performed without anesthesia. The field hospital surgical team was made up of 6 surgeons and 1 surgical nurse. Betty. They operated around the clock non-stop, performing urgent surgery for blood loss, massive chest, head and abdominal wounds, amputations, and splinting severe compound fractures. They also treated patients for serious thoracic, orthopedic, neurological, facial, and dental problems. The Germans moved very fast, capturing one town after another as the Soviets retreated, suffering enormous losses. Being always at the front line, the field hospital followed the army northeast. They moved away the equipment, medications, and wounded, camouflaging themselves with tree branches the entire time, thus giving the appearance of the woods. They quickly learned that the Germans showed no mercy for anybody. The field hospital didn't keep patients for too long, transferring them to the hospital behind the front line. But it was always overcrowded anyway because the casualties were too high. There were not enough people to pick up the wounded from the battlefields, so it was often up to Betty to do the job. She never thought about her limp leg because she had 2 legs, and carrying or pulling wounded soldiers to safety or operating on them under fire became a normal procedure. The fatalities were terribly high, and it seemed that people had no other option but to just die. Like everybody else, Betty felt that her death was just a matter of time and could happen any moment. An option to live was not considered anymore. Death ruled the world. In September 1941, the Soviets stopped moving back because the great city of Leningrad was behind them. Retreat was not an option anymore, and the siege of Leningrad had begun. The Germans attacked systematically, causing terrible fatalities, destroying buildings, railroads, and highways. Bombardment, starvation, and death ruled the city and the suburban areas. Civilians and wounded soldiers received 100 grams of bread a day. Soldiers on duty received 50 grams more, but it was not enough. People dropped dead due to starvation on the streets by the hundreds. Even thousands a day. Soon, the Leningrad pedestrians had grown accustomed to the look of death. Betty received 150 grams of bread and suffered as everybody else. However, on one occasion, the chief doctor caught her sharing her food with a very sick soldier. "What do you think you are doing?" he yelled at her. "He won't survive without food, doctor," she explained. "He is a big man. I can manage. I'm small. I don't need as much as he does. If he dies, the country loses another soldier. If you die, the country loses an experienced nurse that could rescue 100 of them. Doctor, I know how to survive. I can find grass. I can catch mice, birds, and frogs, but he can't. I swear." The doctor was angry. "If I see you sharing your bread with anybody, I'll shoot you. Feed them frogs, but keep bread to yourself. It's an order." One day, Betty brought several civilian women to the field hospital to take care of wounded soldiers, giving them instructions on what to do. The general doctor was pleased. "I thank you so much for your help," he said. "It's very thoughtful of you to volunteer in the hospital." The women got confused. "We are not volunteering. Betty hired us," they replied. "What do you mean hired?" "Yeah. She said that she'll pay us," they assured the doctor. He questioned Betty, being very upset. "Who gave you permission to hire people? We don't have budget for this. You don't have to pay them." "Doctor, you pay me a very big salary. I really don't need it." Betty replied simply, and thought, "We'll all die here sooner or later. There is no use to it. Why are you doing this, Betty?" The general doctor was surprised. "Doctor, look, the wounded are brought to the hospital non-stop. We don't have enough personnel to take care of all of them. These are just pieces of paper that have no meaning. What good do they do sitting in my packet? People are dying. And I'm glad I can help them out by using these pieces of paper for something really important." Even though Betty was a nurse, she had performed surgeries as a doctor for a long time already. The soldiers still called her nurse, but they also called her Talisman, not knowing that it was already her nickname. She had a healing power, and they felt it. She was softly spoken and firm at the same time. She was bright and inspiring. She could quiet an anxious wounded soldier with just a look, locking eyes with him. If she said everything would be okay, they trusted it would. If she said that you could do it, they knew they could, no question asked. They loved her comforting, charming personality, and when she came to their shed, they followed her with their eyes, ready to give away anything just to have her near. Every one of them hoped that she would come, sit next to him, smile and touch him, placing her hand on his forehead or holding his hand. They loved her, and she loved all of them back. They treated her as a sister, and they all were brothers to her. It took too much time to scrub for every surgery, and there were too many of them. Betty didn't have time to scrub every time she needed to eat, go to bathroom, or take care of her other needs. Therefore, a young soldier, Simon, was assigned to assist Betty with all her needs. He was glad because he could stand close to her and watch her every move and glance. He was her second pair of hands, eyes, and ears. If Betty's face was sweaty, he wiped it off. When she needed to drink, he gave her water, holding a glass. He fed her between surgeries. He fixed her face mask or cap if it was needed. If Betty needed to go to the bathroom, he covered her with a blanket, pulled up her skirt, took off her underwear so she could relieve herself. And then he dressed her. Simon was a very handsome young man, and before the war, he loved to fool around with different girls. His mother, Reva, didn't approve, and his older brother, Samuel, and the extended family, often made fun of him. Simon never took offense and always enjoyed watching girls melting over him. He was a heartbreaker and never believed in love, until now. Betty was different. Her eyes produced a glow of desire to save soldiers' lives, which scorched the inside of her soul. He adored her for her endurance, knowing that she wouldn't stop to rest, wouldn't slow down, taking every last ounce of her energy to save a soldier. Watching this tiny girl working tirelessly around the clock always left him feeling puzzled. Simon felt lucky, having a chance to be next to her. He watched her closely, wishing that he could watch her in a different situation. He knew the fragrance of her body, every curve of her face, and every lock of her hair. He could predict every move she made and every breath she took. Simon was in love with Betty, and she knew that, but her heart belonged to another man, Lev. Betty had been working for 36 hours, when a group of soldiers brought in a new wounded. A grenade got stuck in his chest, one of them described. It didn't blow up, but it can blow up any moment. They placed him on a table and stepped away. I need volunteers to help me out, Betty said. A couple of soldiers stepped forward. Betty, are you sure? The general doctor asked her in a low voice. Let me do this. No, she said. If I die, the country loses a nurse. If you die, the country loses a doctor. Everybody out, the doctor commanded. They left the shed, with only volunteers and Simon standing right next to her, not moving. I don't have anesthetic, Betty explained to the volunteers. You would have to hold him very tight. Hey, brother, just take it easy. One of them spoke to the wounded. It's going to be all right. The soldiers held him tight as Betty cut him open. He cried painfully as she removed the grenade gently and headed to the exit. Simon followed her. Anticipating her every move, he opened the shed door and Betty stepped outside. She walked farther and farther from the shed, with Simon following closely behind her all the time. All the others stood aside, keeping quiet. She placed the grenade on the ground very carefully, and stepped back. Run! Simon whispered into her ear from behind, and at the next moment, stepped between the grenade and Betty. She turned around and ran as fast as she could, but it seemed like every step she made was an eternity. Simon was running behind her, and his every step echoed inside her ears. His boot touched the ground. A gray, dusty cloud spread in mid-air. His boot hit the ground, birthing into Betty's ears the sound of crashing dirt and rocks. His boot stepped on a small dried tree branch, breaking it, and the cracking noise suddenly dissolved into the sound of the exploded bomb behind him. The force of the explosion lifted them both up into the air and threw them farther away. Simon fell on Betty and felt the fragrance of her body. God, he loved her so much. As debris fell down, Betty turned around and moved him to the ground. She was covered with his warm, sticky blood. She checked on his lethal wounds, as he was looking at her. I love you, Betty, he whispered. I love you too, Simon, she replied. After smiling at her, Simon died in her arms.